Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings and salutations. My name is Tristan Waddy, and I'm joined by the focus, the dynamo, the visionary himself in the security world. Of course, Russ. Thank you for joining today, Russ, as the co host. And what we have today, Russ, as you well know, is an interesting topic, one that is exciting in the security world. And why is that? One, because it's episode 2 of this show, which we called The Safe Room, featuring security side quests. And it's also Monday. So happy Monday as well. So, with this first episode, in I would say a Monday capacity, actually it's 2, right? Who's counting? But if you were if you weren't here for the first episode, what I wanted to say is welcome. And I also wanted to say and tell you things may look a little bit different. Things may seem a little bit off. And you may ask why. Well, that's because the safe room and security side quests came together like ice cream and french fries, like maple syrup on pizza, like the fusion dance in Dragon Ball Z, as we said last episode, to spread the joy of AWS security. And I want to say, which one of those, Russ, do you pick? If you had to pick ice cream and french fries or maple syrup on pizza, you had to choose. Which one is it?
Can I go with the DBZ transformation? Because I prefer that one over the others.
Yeah.
What happened to peanut butter and jelly? Spaghetti and meatballs.
Yeah.
The classics.
Yeah. Well, I do peanut butter on hamburgers, but that's a different story and a different side quest for a different day. But I digress. So I would say, hey, chat, how's it going today? Welcome in. And if you're joining us today from anywhere on the interwebs, say hi and tell us where you're dialing in from. Because we always like to say hello and welcome. And if you want to share a little bit of additional information, I would say, what's your favorite 90s cartoon? For me, Batman the Animated Series, Cowboy Bebop, or Courage the Cowardly Dog. Those 3 unrelated. What about you, Russ?
Oof. I'm gonna have to go with Hey Arnold. Used to be my favorite. The old football head.
Yeah, that's a good
classic.
One. Yeah.
But also, what was it? The 90s? That was the Amazing Spider-Man cartoons. I grew up on those. Those are my other favorite.
Yeah, the opening on that one always got me. The guitar riff when yeah. If I try to say it, the stream might skip a little bit. My voice isn't here today, right? But thank you for joining in today. And we have people coming in from Florida and Ghana. Nice to see you in. And as we continue on along this happy route, continue to flood the chat with where you're dialing from in your favorite 90s cartoon, because we'd like to hear, we like to see it. And we also like to watch 90s cartoons sometimes from time to time, right? So as we begin and go down, hey, did we want to go down the route of understanding a little bit more of generative AI security, specifically when it comes to data protection, and more specifically going into the tooling? I think we do. So with that spirit, let's have a little bit of fun and talk about today's topic. Let's delve a little bit more. For those who are inquiring about what does this exactly mean, this sentence? Well, today's adventure, today's topic is going with the title, Is Dangerous to Go Alone. Take this. Tools for AI data security. As always, 10 billion points to you if you get this reference. But for those who need just a tad bit more context, the inspiration of today's episode stems from a certain game series where a adventurer is trying to save his land, but to do so, he has to gather a vast amount of tools. Just a couple. Some of them are in a water area, but I digress. This led us to think about some of the goals and how they correlate to what we do as practitioners of the cloud, as practitioners of security. And we thought it would be the perfect title, because in today's show, we're mainly going to focus in about 4 areas. And those 4 areas are going to be, 1, in the initial challenges with AI data governance. We're speaking about data volume and the complexity, right? Managing large scale data sets in, let's say, S3, ensuring there's proper access controls, sometimes a lack of standardization, sometimes you're moving fast and there's some privacy concerns, regulatory compliance. And then with all of that, you try to say, hey, how do we do this? What tools do we use? And that's kind of continuing on from last week. Because when it comes to the tool perspective, there's a lot of tools that customers consider. So we're going to delve in and have a couple of conversations about that. And then you pick a tool. Now, how do we implement? What are some of the hurdles that come from implementation? What are some of the IM policies that come with it? Because we always like to have least privilege in the back of our head. But I digress. And going along those same lines, success metrics. How do we gauge that we were successful in our little adventure? Of all of those commits that we did, how did we meet the mark? And that's kind of the shape of today's episode. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I would say, I think where we want to be is answering chat for once, because I want to see where people are coming in from. We have India coming in. We have the Bay Area coming in. Welcome. And Rugrats. Yes. Rugrats. The top 5 there, right? The opening is stuck in my head as well. We got Ninja Turtles. Well, I would say I'm a Ninja Turtles fan, but you cannot prove it. Maybe you can't prove it, but I digress on that. So, hello and welcome. Wonderful community. But Russ, do you want to take us through kind of like an overview of AI data security and the tools that we may use?
Yeah, definitely. When we're discussing AI data security, we're taking a lot of the same principles from regular data security. So, one of our foremost and most important security principles for that is going to be our IAM, how we authenticate to various services. We're going to touch on that today, but the most of the tooling that we're going to focus on is maybe a little bit more security flavored. So we're going to look into Macie. We're going to look into KMS, the Key Management Service, as well as CloudWatch for all of your logging and monitoring needs. So, mostly taking the same principles that we use for data protection and just tweaking them to work with our AI and ML models.
Exactly. And I think that was one of the takeaways from last week, is really just thinking about what is our target state security strategy normally, right? Before AI, it was to have a minimum security baseline in place and start to build from that and start to expand out, to start to automate. And that same principle still applies, right? Because you want to make sure that, hey, are we leveraging security best practices within our environment? Do we know what those security best practices are? And how can we leverage AWS tooling in order to move us towards that target state security strategy? And I think that also brings into focus kind of the different places our customers are at. They're in different journeys, but they're heading towards similar goals. So I think one of the areas that we want to touch upon is, what are some of the common challenges you've seen, Russ, or the misconceptions, let's say?
I mean, where do you begin? That's such a large topic. Yep. I mean, there's so many misconceptions about AI security. Having to do so much more or something more complex than just protecting your data. So I think the big one is that misunderstanding that AI is somehow, a sci-fi type of technology that people don't understand. You still have to protect using the same, protection principles that you do with S3, even if you're in SageMaker. So there's a
Yeah,
lot of different ones like, excuse me, sorry. There's a lot of ones
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
You don't have to be super proficient as a coder or with programming languages. If you're able to take those basic security best practices and principles, ensuring MFA, utilizing IAM best practices, limiting security groups, those are going to be the core of your data protection strategy. You don't, not trying to reinvent the wheel, even though we are with AI trying to reinvent the wheel. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel as far as protection goes, data protection. So taking some of the best, most basic security practices and implementing that into these services in your account, are going to go a much longer way than having to take the sci-fi route and not understanding fully. So
and you touched upon a couple of different areas. I think one of those pieces is just looking at, hey, this is, yes, a new technology, but it's not completely out of our wheelhouse, right? If we break things down to the ones and zeros, as I say, and take it step by step, you're able to see there's a couple of areas that stay the same. And those misconceptions often come from, you know, putting the cart before the horse in some instances, things like that, whatever metaphor, analogy that you want to use. But I think taking that step back and really looking at what you want to do with the technology is a very important part. And then from there, saying, okay, what are the different mechanisms or tools or pipelines that we can use? And I think the second part that you also mentioned is, hey, what if I'm not a programmer, a developer, or a coder? How can I leverage these best practices? I think that's a very important part, because sometimes taking that step back and just looking at it from a broad perspective, if you're looking at an architectural diagram, or if you're just speaking to somebody at a conference or in a conference room, how do you explain, hey, there's this new item and we want to leverage it, but we just have to tweak a little bit of how we view things, how we implement things, how we kind of understand things, but it's not deviating too much from our baseline. And that's kind of where we're trying to get to. So I think one of the places that we want to understand, and we'll probably put a poll up for this, is what, when it comes to tooling, which AI security tool category most interests you? I think that would be interesting to add in. So put it in the chat, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which one of these security tool categories interests you the most? If I had to pick one, data classification. And there's a reason why. Because when you think of how you classify data, most people go sensitive and what are different categories that we have to do based on this specific, let's say, industry standard. But I have a more selfish reason, is being able to neatly organize things so that you're able to put tags on them or classify them. Because often what you see happens, I don't know if you ran into this, Russ, is just a smosh of data together. And then you're having conversations with a customer and you're just like, all right, where's your sensitive data? In this bucket. Okay, where's your non-sensitive data? In this bucket. Wait, that's the same bucket. Okay, in the same folder, in the same. And then you start going from there, right? So what about you, Rose? Which one would you pick?
Well, you make a lot of great points, but I'm going to have to go with access control. I'm a big proponent of, just having IAM down pat will save you such a headache, especially when we're talking about incidents. So really, for me, it's access control and IAM. Making sure that specific policies are in place for who can access what, using specific resource-based access controls. Yeah, I'm a big fan. So got to go with access control.
Yeah, that's also a good one. All of these are good. And I see someone put monitoring and auditing. That's another good one. Thank you, Denise, for contributing. And we have all of these different areas. all these different items that we want to make sure that we touch upon when we're having conversations, right? Because you can't talk about data classification and not talking about monitoring and auditing and then access control and policy enforcement. Because hey, you can have access control, but if there's no way to enforce your policies, then hey, how do we do this? How do we go forward? I think that's a very important part. So feel free to continue to drop ones and twos in the chat as we continue on, because this sets us up perfectly almost. And what does it set us up for? Well, if I were to take that step back and pause, we have a title essentially. We have a theme. So that means we have a side quest. And if we have a side quest, that means we have some fun ahead. But before we get on the side quest, we always have the motto we hold near and dear to our hearts when it comes to side quests. And that is security by 1,000 commits. Security by 1,000 commits essentially mean taking small steps or side quests that help you to contribute to your overall security posture. Another reason to ask yourself why side quests are important is because side quests can be anything. It can be a deep dive, reading, Q&A, or we could take that dramatic pause and we can say it can also be a little bit of echo. But outside of echo, it can also be a little bit of a legend. And side quests are usually legendary. So let us begin with saying, as Side Quest legend has it, we continue our story of our noble, I would say noble, yeah, let's say noble individual who was tasked with something that they weren't really familiar with. So if you weren't here last time, I will say last time on Security Side Quest in my best announcer voice and say there was a cloud practitioner who was relatively new to the AWS cloud, and they were trying to figure out, how do I secure my environment? Because, hey, I finished all my Jira story points. I finished, securing my environment. Game over, right? It's done. No, there's more to this, right? It's a circle. If you don't believe it's a circle, go to the threat detection side of the house, right? A little iteration. But they thought they wanted to go down the path of understanding, hey, how do I secure and implement Gen AI solutions? Well, they figured out what the baseline is, what the baseline was. Now that I understand where the baseline is, how do I get the right tools in place? So if I'm a financial service individual cloud practitioner that's trying to understand these different components, we go to the side quest board. And let's take it that we have our individual here. Okay? They're authenticated user. We'll check that box off. Now, we're trying to identify the tools that will help us get to our AWS environment in a secure manner. So we have the first road piece. So what is this first road piece? Well, it's taking a deep dive and helping to understand, what challenges am I facing? All right, I have data that's going to be used by generative AI or AI models. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to find out what is out there. What are the other challenges that come with implementing the tools? So let us begin over here. That looks like a good path to go down. Because oftentimes the challenge for identifying the tools is making sure you understand the industry. What I mean by that is it's rapidly evolving, it's rapidly growing. There's a complexity that comes with a data ecosystem. Organizations often have and use multiple data storage types, right? They're always processing. Data flows between sometimes on-prem and the cloud. Sometimes it goes cloud to cloud, different organizations. And then there's regulatory compliance that comes into play as well. So how am I'm going to go to the chat and say, hello from India. All right, how do I get from India to Ethiopia? If we were just thinking about that, what regulatory requirements come into play? While we're we're looking at this, even if we were just connected by who's in chat. So those are some of the areas that we're going on in our quest. So that's the first building block. And there's, of course, cost considerations and different stakeholder needs and things of that nature. But let us look at some tools that we can use. So I would say the first piece to go down and understand in our scenario is, let's pick a service. If we have S3, maybe we leverage something like the Macy card. And what is the Macy card? Well, think of Amazon Macy. We have different areas. Yes, exactly. HIPAA, SOC 2, PCI. Pick one, depending on what organization you're under. So if we're in the financial services, we're leaning more on the PCI side of the house, let's say. But as we continue on in our side quests, if we were to leverage Macy, there are different customer stories that come to mind with this. And one of the individual stories, I would say, really goes to, hey, I have a financial services customer that has a vast amount of sensitive data. They have ambitious AI and machine learning initiatives. They have a lot of regulatory requirements to meet, and they have growing concerns about data security and privacy. Sounds like a common theme that's heard over and over. So if we are that practitioner and we're challenged with rapidly AI initiative that needs us to evolve a little bit when it comes to building an ironclad data protection, well, seems like a balancing act a little bit. So I'm also curious, put it in the chat. How many of you are currently grappling with a similar challenge in your organizations? You know, drop some type of comment or thumbs up in order to see if it's resonating with you. But if we were to continue with this scenario and the individual scenario that I was thinking of, one of the ways that financial services organizations helped to increase their capabilities was they went down the path of, okay, we have Amazon Macy. Let's integrate it into our CI/CD. Right? By integrating into the development pipeline, it helps to automatically scan for sensitive data before, let's say, a model deploys. Then they have auto remediation built in using Lambda. So they set up an automatic response to the Macy findings that revoke, let's say, public access or applying encryption, something along those lines. And then they can generate a compliance report weekly. And with this, they were able to achieve a vast amount of results by leveraging and thinking about their tool set. So if we're leveraging Macy and taking that one step at a time, then, hey, the accuracy goes up of identifying sensitive data. There's a reduction in the time spent in compliance audits. And it led to faster AI model deployments. Why? Because, one, we understand where our sensitive data is. And we were talking about it earlier, and this is kind of where my data classification bias came in, because it's like, hey, where's our sensitive data? How do I know what data is what? Especially when we are delving into the AI realm. And then if we have that piece in play, all right, let's go down another route. So if I can figure out how to put this in, there we go. So if we continue on that route and say, hey, all right, we have Macy, but there's some more services we need to understand and need to put into place. And what does your encryption strategy look like? We're leveraging data. How are you encrypting that data? Or better yet, let's think about how the different individuals may be using data within your organization. And you may say, what does that mean? What does this icon mean? And I would say, hey, SageMaker, has anybody heard of that service? Is anybody using it? What if I play these two face up? right? In card game words, and say KMS and SageMaker. Well, now we can start to think about, hey, all my SageMaker notebooks, the training jobs, the deployed models were encrypted using KMS keys. You can create custom key policies that allow for fine-grained access controls. And then you can start to get into key rotation and model monitoring, right? Because SageMaker Model Monitor helps to detect, let's say, drift and model quality issues. And all these are important parts that come into play, especially when you're looking at, how does this affect me? How do I increase my security posture? And it's interesting that I put it up there because you're like, all right, I'm done. Well, that kind of goes around. It doesn't connect just right. And why is that? Well, we still have something missing. Well, what is that one item missing? All right, so we have Macie. We have, let's say, SageMaker. We have KMS. But how are we tying all this together with some monitoring? And this piece is played to the board. So think of something like CloudWatch. Simple item. You have all these workloads, and our individual is trying to figure out the tools, what to implement, the baselines. Well, we're coming to a point where by taking everything one step at a time, thinking about, one, how Macie works, how SageMaker works, how KMS works. Now we're thinking of the monitoring, and we could go CloudWatch to EventBridge and so on and so forth, but it's taking those small steps. And I also say, hello, Hector from Mexico City. Nice to see you. And as we continue on, I know we always speak about identity as well. And if I were to put identity, I'd put it up there in the middle somewhere, right? Because it's in the middle of everything. This is how we have least privilege and how we tie everything together just right. And as we continue on, we start to say, hey, what else do we need? What else do we need to put into place? Well, it's interesting because we are going down an interesting path. And why do I say it's an interesting path? Because there are so many services that you can use and they're all interconnected. But we are taking a simple path in order to secure some of our data, whether S3 or EFS. These are the different models or different storage sources, I should say, let's say a model can use. And leveraging those tools will have you in a place where you're a little bit legendary if you're an individual that can piece all these items together. And with that being said, what I wanted to do as we're talking through this is hit the pause button and pause the game and kind of let's bring it back a little bit, because we have a couple different areas to talk about. And I know, Russ, you were listening and I saw you nodding your head a couple of times in the manner of, hey, he might be cooking right now. But the other side of that is, what do you think about some of these tools from a data protection standpoint?
Well, so there's a lot, but the one thing that jumped out to me is people are going to use these tools in different ways depending on how they're leveraging their AI and ML services. So, when we're looking at tools like Macie or SageMaker or KMS, we can be explaining basically one thing that, is a good step for you to take. But maybe for someone else who's using, an enterprise app instead of a customer app, or they're not using a customer app, they're using pre-trained models. So depending on, what your use case is, your security architecture is going to look very different. But I think you did an excellent job of kind of going through how these services are all interconnected. and going down basically the list right there.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And it's an interesting list, right? When you start to go through, because the list keeps growing a little bit, and that's kind of where that focus comes in. And especially when we go to Marco in the chat, is thank you. We're trying, but when it comes to best practices to test security, so what's the best practice to test the security if it's ready to go to production? So I think this is an interesting question that we often have to take a step back to answer, right? And what I mean by that is the testing process should be happening in multiple environments. It's not just production. So when you think of your development environment, how do you promote your code from dev to maybe UAT, and then from UAT to prod? And in between that, you have your CI/CD with, let's say we go back to our side quest story. Hey, if we put Macie into the pipeline to detect sensitive data, that is happening along the way. So by the time you get to production, you're literally just promoted into another environment, and that's kind of the finalized source, or the source of truth. But along the way, when it comes to security, it should be from the beginning of the process and throughout the process, and it should be influencing the process, because you want to make sure that, hey, when you go to production, it's not just done, right? Things start to continue on to be updated, right? It start to be patched and things of that nature. So you want to make sure that you have a process in place to understand what's happening in production and how you can continue to modify it. And then I'll throw it to you, Rush.
Yeah, definitely. That's your answer is 100% spot on. Love it, because we're such a proponent of baking in security from the beginning, but it also goes back to kind of what we were referring to earlier, where these are already existing security principles. Baking in security into the software development lifecycle. Same thing with your AI services. So I think that's a great answer. I can't do that at all, but also it's another point that comes to mind is that you also want to bake security in from the beginning, because security is also an iterative process. So as you're doing your CI/CD, security is a part of that, and so you're constantly making adjustments based on what you're seeing, or use cases from your app, for example. You have to kind of continue that process on. So it's not like, oh, it's just a step in the process. Like it's baked into the process. So
yeah,
you definitely want to maintain those security best practices, even with services with AI.
exactly. And that's one of the main things. And I think you often look at stuff from kind of the threat responder standpoint as well, right? Of how to iterate the process based on what you're seeing, because Russ has seen some items and has helped different individuals to get through the understanding of, from start to finish, how can we make this a little bit better, right? And I think this question really speaks to that, right? Of that iterative process that you were mentioning. So really good question. And thank you, Marco. So when we start to go through and understand, hey, what is the next step in kind of data protection and controls and things of that nature, I think it's important to understand kind of, one, we're speaking of the tool set, but I also think what would be interesting, Russ, is maybe kind of going through what we were speaking about last week with like the scoping matrix. I think that would be a good area to jump into next to kind of tie things together.
Absolutely. So we're going to go through this. There's a couple of figures here. It's a bit of a process. So I'm just going to not get too into the weeds with this, because everything's very dependent on your use case. So this is the general security scoping matrix. That is a mouthful. But yeah, so this is what I was referring to earlier. Based on your use case, what are you using? Are you using a consumer app, enterprise app? Do you have your own self-trained model? A lot of those things are going to determine how you want to protect your data. Because if you have your own self-trained model, you have to look at, your training data and protecting that as well, as opposed to using an enterprise or consumer application. So next we go into governance. This is also, again, very based off of your use case. So that's going to be highly customized. And this is basically what you would look at for governance and compliance. So guidelines, compliance monitoring and reporting, the data that was used to train the model, there's compliance processes for the frameworks. There's a lot that needs to, different control accesses and stuff like that. And then this is kind of a little architecture over what would be considered provider control versus customer control. This kind of just goes into the governance piece based on what you're looking to do, what application you're running, and kind of those different access controls that you need to implement. Legal and privacy, that's definitely a consideration, especially when you're looking at, international businesses. You have multiple frameworks and privacy laws. It's a lot. So, based on what level of what your use case is and what level of AI and LLM you're using is going to determine like what regulations and laws that you're going to fall under. And then we go to risk management. This is going to be pretty similar to, non-AI risk management. Same thing. You'll still be doing threats and threat modeling, looking at the OWASP for AI. There's a lot that can go into that based off of your use case. But it also can be just a third-party risk assessment if you're using like an enterprise app or a consumer app and you're not training your own data. So then we move on to controls. Again, very based off of use case, but for example, controlling, fine-grained access to maybe different services or different workflows within your account. And the last one will be resilience. So ensuring that your service is available. How are you going to do that? Based off of use case, multiple different options. But I did want to kind of go back a little bit. This is a way to framework, model, what you need to be thinking about as far as security concerns with your services. So that kind of begs the question, like, well, how? I see here, understanding availability, ensuring your service is available, stuff like that. How do I do that? So we're kind of going to go into the tools, what we'd recommend and some of the tools that you can use to try to increase that security posture, bake that into the process as you're kind of going through and designing your architecture. It's baked into the process in the beginning and not just an add-on later. So going back to our list from earlier, right? I believe data classification was number one. No bias there. You got to put your choice as number one, but whatever.
Yeah. Nobody knows that. Oh, I picked up on it. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. You can tell who the real control is here. But no, so like data classification. So that shoots right into Macie. And so what is Macie? Let's just start off there, right? Macie is a managed service that uses AI and ML to classify data. So like you referenced earlier, that's useful for things like PCI, HIPAA, PII. It's important to be able to discover that sensitive data in order to protect that sensitive data. it's exactly what you were referring to earlier, how they kind of come together to create that security depth, defense in depth. You know what I mean? So in order to know what your most sensitive data is, Macie can help you with that, so that way you can protect what that sensitive data is. So Macie will go through and continuously evaluate your S3 buckets, looks for security and access controls, generates findings if there are things like unencrypted buckets, sensitive information. It's kind of a one-stop shop basically for data classification, and it kind of ties in really well to how we are securing our AI services and workloads. This is kind of just an example diagram here. This would be the master account, the management org, and then the actual organization accounts. So you'd have your delegated admin running Macie, which would go through to the S3 analysis. That's where Macie actually is running. And then we'll go into CloudWatch in a little bit, but it'll create a CloudWatch event that comes back here to number 2 event bridge, which should trigger a Lambda. So an alert, an email, whatever that might be. So this is kind of just like, we're talking about how tools interconnect, but what are they, and what should I use? Are probably going to be the biggest questions on your mind. So that's going to be Macie. That's going to.
Yeah, definitely. And the one thing I would quickly add into that is there's a couple of comments in the chat of the focus on reactive controls and not so much on preventative controls and different systems. And I think that ties into what exactly you're saying. So I just wanted to highlight that as one of the really great things, especially within this diagram, is showing you how, let's say, you can build items into your pipeline in order to say, hey, maybe I just build in and make it secure by design when it comes to having something like Macie in the pipeline, having the CloudWatch alarms and things of that nature. And also noticing another comment, Lewis, you're right. There's a bunch of tools out there. So make sure that you have that understanding. So just a couple of comments from the chat, but back to you, Russ.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the case. And so next, I figure we'll move on to access control. So what tools do we have for access controls? There's a bunch. IAM, I'm a pretty big fan of IAM, controlling who can and cannot access things in your account. And so that's going to be a big tool, but we want to focus today, and I think you're going to go into it a little bit more in depth, but KMS, the key management system, to be able to control and fine tune who or what role or user has access to those sensitive data. So providing authentication and securing those keys in a safe manner that allows you to access those and really get fine-tuned with what principal is going to be accessing your data. So I'm not going to get too deep into that because you will be.
Condition keys. Use condition keys. That's the main. If there's one takeaway item from least privilege, say condition keys, right? Making sure that you have those pieces in place. And I think that's a very important area to also delve into, right? As we're starting to go a little bit deeper, right? If you haven't noticed, we're kind of going a little bit deeper every episode, but digress for a second. And Russ, if I could just interject for a second, because I think there's a little bit more of some side quests that we need to touch upon real quick, right? If we use that little segue. And I think one of the pieces, I think the setup for that is last week we were Adventurer level 1. Now this week I think we're Adventurer level 2. So level Adventurer, but I think we're a level 2 Adventurer. We started to get into the tool sets. We started to look at diagrams. We started to look at architecture, how things integrate and how things alert us. So I think one of the pieces that we can delve into is starting to understand a little bit more, as you mentioned, Russ, about something like KMS, something about Macie. There's a bunch of different resources, but there's something that was said in the chat that I think was very interesting, and it's dangerous to go alone. So take this, right? So don't go alone. And I think one of the things that we need to think about as practitioners is, hey, what else do we need to think about? Well, the question I pose back is, have you ever conducted a security tool assessment? And I think that's an interesting thing to pose to the chat is, have you audited your tools themselves? Because often what I've seen, and Russ, maybe you've seen this as well, is customers keep getting tools within the environment, enabling tools and testing tools. But sometimes they don't take that full step back to audit the tools that they have to say, hey, where's the overlap? Where's the gaps? What is this one covering? What is that one covering? So if you ever conducted a security tool assessment, say yes or no in the chat. I'd be interesting just to have this little, little side quest answered. But when you start to think of different items, I know there was a question in chat. Any chance you'll feature things like IAM Anywhere Cedar? I think there's a high chance of that, especially when it comes to leveraging Cedar, because there's things like maybe a security lake. Maybe we'll get into it at some point in the future. And I think diving into the different ways that somebody can use identity access management to access an environment. If we go to the verified permissions route, just regular identity route, AVA, there's a couple different things. So thank you for the question in the chat. And continue on, because the time is slowly ticking down. I want to say we have a couple of pieces that we could dive into. And I don't know about anybody else, but sometimes the route I like to take is just to understand, hey, what's out there in the AWS security world? There's a bunch of, let's say, workshops that you can delve into. A lot of different areas. So I think that's a very important part of the puzzle, especially when it comes to, condition keys, fine grained security. Thank you, Marco. Just had to pop that on the screen one time because we say least privilege 3 times. We have to say condition keys 3 times. But I digress. One of the places to start for guidance, I would say, is, hey, let's delve into the world of prescriptive guidance. So one of the areas when it comes to encryption, I would say encryption best practices. That's right here in the title. And the reason why I would suggest going to this page and going through all the AWS prescriptive guidance areas is, 1, it's prescriptive. And hey, 2, it's all organized by the services and how you can leverage encryption and best practices. So if we're looking at something like S3, like we were talking about, all right, what are the different encryption mechanisms? And I know we spoke about this last week of just understanding the terminology. It's a very important part of the puzzle, because when you know the terminology, you're able to piece things together. And if you're not a developer or a coder, like Russ was saying, there's things that you should be aware of. The terminology definitely helps with there. So one of these areas in the prescriptive guidance is, hey, consider the following best practices for this service. And if you take a look at this list, it's essentially giving you a play-by-play on things that you should look out for when it comes to S3 and encryption. So I think this is an important part that may be overlooked because, like, hey, there's no immediate code on this page that I can leverage within my environment. But what there is guidance. Right? You like the double is, right? You got to take the dramatic pause for the second is. But I think continuing on along those same lines is you also have to start to read some of the blogs. And I think an important part to take that step back and think about is what I like to call the articles of the day. You may ask, what are the articles of the day? Well, the articles of the day are those pieces of documentation that you grab after your 5 a.m. run, of course, right? You grab the beverage of your choice, coffee, tea, water, or other, and you sit down and say, hey, what's happening in the AWS security world? What should I know when it comes to generative AI security? What should I kind of implement and think about? Well, that's where the articles of the day come in. I think today's article is going to mainly stem from, let's say, threat modeling. I think that's a big piece. And as I pull that document up and share out my screen, because, hey, of course, I can continue talking and yeah, of course. Let me share it out again. Right? I got to keep talking because that's how we keep the airways going. But threat modeling your generative AI workloads. You see what I did there? So when we start to think about what can go wrong, what did we do right? All those different things. We start to think about, hey, threat modeling. And this is a big area. And this is a big side quest in itself of just thinking about how to threat model these different areas. So this is one of the areas, especially when it comes to generative AI threat modeling and understanding those 4 questions that we like to ask. I found myself asking this at a fast food restaurant. It's like, what are you guys working on? What could go wrong with what you're working on, right? But when you think of generative AI security, it's the baselines too, right? See, Russ, you've been there too, right? It's like, okay, what are they working on in the back? Ooh, they don't have gloves on. All right, I know what could go wrong. But when you start to think about these different areas and your outcomes, I think this is a very interesting place to start, especially when you think of, hey, there's different pieces of the puzzle that I need to consider. There's different tools I need to consider. And I think one of the pieces that I would say that I want to recap is we talked about our poll earlier when it came to, hey, what are the different questions? And one of the questions I wanted to pose, and people's already started to answer it in chat, is if you had a summoner spell to help you best protect your AI data, which one would you use? So feel free to put 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the chat, because I would like to see where everybody kind of goes forth with, right? When it comes to flash, teleport, barrier, or cleanse. So interested on this. So Russ, which one are you going with if you were to pick one?
I don't want to choose barrier because I already chose that. So I'm going to go teleport, secure data transfer.
Secure that. It's a nice one, right? Everything kind of, it leads me to another side tangent, which we don't have time for, but it's like, would you rather have the power of flying or teleporting? And I always pick kind of flying, but I would go with this particular poll. I'd have to say the flash part. Just talking about KMS encryption, it's at me. I'm sticking with number 1 again. So I know a lot of people are picking 3, barrier. So I know who to invite to my next D&D, right? We have a bunch of barrier types in there to protect, right? Great. Yep. So feel free to keep putting that in the chat. And I also want to say, remember to subscribe and follow to AWS, right? On the various socials, whether it be LinkedIn or Twitch or YouTube, Facebook, anywhere, wherever you feel comfortable. And also, I wanted to say thank you for joining us today. I think we had a bunch of different areas that we covered in this short period of time. We spoke about, 1, hey, what tools do I need to use? What tools should I consider? And how do I consider them? I think that was very important. And then, Russ, you talked about a couple of good areas of just, hey, where do I start? What is my overview? And working backwards from the customer, right? That's what we always like to do, and we always like to say. But how do we do that? Especially when it comes to the tools. And the scoping matrix is what you brought up. And then what you can do is start to add the tools into those different sections. Because when we have columns, and we love columns, right? We love spreadsheets. We're those type of people. We can start to plug in the different tools and start to maybe perform somewhat of a tool security assessment. And what we can also do is say thank you to the chat, and everybody's contributing. So, and needs more it's funny enough, we had league references last week, but thank you for that. Right. And some gameplay. And also feel free to come back every week at Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, or I would say 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, right? Time zones, right? I always get considered, especially when we have so many people from all over the world joining in. And next week's episode is going to be stay a while and listen as we deep dive into AI security technologies. And Russ, do you have any closing words for the chat and our audience out there?
Yes, I do. Create an incident response plan. And if you have an incident response plan, add an AI scenario.
Yes. That sounds like a very good I wouldn't even say side quest. That's a main quest to do. That is something that everybody should consider. And you know what I have to do? We have to get bigger to say this. We have to say create the proper incident response plan, because what happens from it? Well, it gets into that cycle we were speaking about, right? Where we get to the point of, hey, how do we know if we did right? How do we know our success metrics were really successes? And how can we continue to build upon those successes? Well, sometimes we have to look at some of the times let's say, I would say the data points. And those data points are, hey, maybe something we didn't consider got through, or something happened and we didn't respond to it quick enough. And that's what we need to consider. And how do we do that? Well, we look at our tool set. And that's how we bring it back around. And I would say thank you to everybody for joining. And until next time, feel free to watch 90s cartoons, build your incident response plan, and have a breakfast sandwich with peanut butter and hamburgers. Don't ask me why. So take care, everybody, and have a good one. So see you on the next one. Adios.
Bye.